This story begins with a quick introduction to the realm of wizards, called Pharaohs, exactly at the moment when the Great War for the Throne was entering its final phase. That night, the plan of a powerful noble was simple and cruel: eliminate the ninth prince, Heinz. One of his subordinates awaited this moment with anticipation, as he would accept no other sovereign than the one he served. Heinz was located in a strange palace, and, as a consequence, his execution was ordered along with anyone who stood in the way. Before they departed, however, someone spoke up and, instead of talking, acted, sending one of his own colleagues straight to the beyond. The young man then politely apologizes and asks if he can speak with the second prince, which immediately makes him tremble with fear. A truly loyal subordinate steps forward and takes a defensive stance to confront the intruder. Noticing the red eyes of the invader, he realizes he will have to deal with an old acquaintance, a worthless one without magic. Confident of victory, the man gets excited, but at the exact moment he would say that stealthy attacks wouldn't work, he ends up fainting. With no escape, the second prince is overtaken by despair. That blow was absolute, hitting the nasal bone at the perfect angle to damage the brain, rendering any spell useless after the impact. Even after defeating an opponent, the boy realizes there is still a wizard there, ready to face him. A powerful spell from the thunder spirits was about to be cast, but the conjurer did not expect to be kicked first, having his jaw reshaped in a rather unkind manner. The boy even offers a chance for the wizard to leave. However, even unable to recite incantations, the warrior tries to use something that doesn't require words. This choice results in being thrown down the stairs with a single blow. The second prince can only wonder how a swordsman and a Class A wizard were defeated in such a way. The boy then explains that there is no rule stating that only magic can cause damage. In a panic, the prince draws his weapon and asks if Heinz sent the intruder, but despite being an assassin, the young man denies it. Claiming he is there because of a friend, the noble practically loses his reason. After all, there was no possibility of a Garuda maintaining friendship with someone of royalty, the prince insists, wanting to know what the price would be to spare him. However, hearing that makes the intruder relive bitter memories and decide to end the favor quickly. Sometime later, the death of the second prince is announced as a result of an illness, with the coffin kept closed. Thus, the long shadow that hung over the palace finally begins to dissipate. While reading in his chambers, a noble is surprised by the same figure as before, who calls him by name, Heinz. With the younger brother out of the way, there was no doubt he would be the next king. The assassin asks how he feels seeing his dream come true. Heinz, however, replies that this is just the beginning. As he promised before, the blonde asserts that upon taking the throne, he will abolish all discriminatory laws against the magicless people. Having known him for so long, the assassin doesn't even question it, as they are true friends. Soon the issue arises of a Garuda not being able to participate in the coronation. Heinz makes it clear that he will grant permission, which excites his companion. Although the assassin knows he must not cause confusion, he understands that changing mindsets takes time and that not everything happens overnight. In light of this, Heinz suggests that his friend return to his hometown for a while. The assassin agrees. After all, with the war over, resting seemed the best way to calm the mind. Later that same day, he wrings out a cloth and cleans himself as best as he can. With a lantern in hand, he explores an apparently abandoned place, filled with arcane books and training dummies. The young man has difficulty believing that all that life of combat had finally come to an end. Since he had no magic, no one could detect him, something extremely useful for someone in his profession. From the start, the most dangerous enemies would be powerful wizards, as well as swordsmen and martial artists. Therefore, if he couldn't handle opponents like that, he suggested learning magic too. Heinz immediately remembered that his friend did not possess that gift, but the decision was already made. The boy decided to study magic more than anyone else and train his body until he overcame that disadvantage. That was the pact made between the two before everything began. Revisiting those study materials, the assassin realizes that indeed, it had been a long and exhausting war. Finally, on his routine outing the next day, a vendor calls him from afar to check the news at the stall. There were some fresh pineapples for sale, something rare in that region. The boy thinks about buying one to gift a companion, certain that it would make her happy. Then the merchant states the price, a copper coin. But upon noticing the red eyes beneath the customer's hood, he immediately refuses the sale. Faced with this, the assassin pulls out 2 silver coins from his pocket and asks if the man really wants to work or not. As expected, murmurs begin, everyone commenting on a Garuda walking freely among them. As the boy advances, people step back, fearing they too will be cursed. The curse they refer to involves the only race known not to possess magic, the Garuda. Years ago, a king decided that the Garuda would be treated like cattle by the Alcair, creating a power system based solely on magic. They were used as slaves, sent as cannon fodder in wars, and, as if that weren't enough, massacres that were once ignored began to be encouraged. Basically, all the country's problems ended up being placed on the backs of the Garuda, something extremely convenient for the monarchy. All of that made the assassin's stomach churn. Still, the most he could do was pray for a day when everything would change radically. In the middle of the path, the boy encounters a little girl who stumbles while trying to keep up with her friends and starts to cry. Like any decent adult, he stops to help her, and then she notices his red eyes, showing some apprehension. However, her reaction was not one of judgment, but of admiration. It was the first time someone reacted that way, and the child soon left, leaving the Garuda with a strange taste of hope. More than ever, the day when he would be treated as an equal seemed near, and that was just the beginning. Sometime later, night falls, and after 10 years away, the young man begins to wonder how he will be received. Years ago, still in the cabin, his mother scolded him for playing with the knife instead of handing it over. Even while insisting that he find a job, it never sounded like pressure, but rather like care. She only wanted her son to find work and give his best. Knowing he might face difficulties, she made sure to remind him, along with his sister, that the doors would always be open for his return. 10 years later, the boy still carried an amulet that connected him to those family times. However, despite it already being night, the place was as bright as day and hot as hell. At that moment, the hopeful future the assassin had built crumbled once again. Seeing all that fire, the boy's first reaction is to wonder if everyone is alive. For the first time, he says his name out loud, Van, to make it clear that he is there. Unfortunately, Van finds a resident lying on the ground in terrible condition. And it wasn't just one. There were other bodies, as well as people executed and hanging from a tree. All had familiar faces, which made the boy's mind collapse. For Van, it made no sense for criminals to go so far. But the most urgent thing was to find his mother and his sister, Rena. Everything he had done until then had been for them. His greatest wish was to turn that country into a place where both could live happily. That was until he reached where his home used to be and faced the worst possible scene. There was also someone hanging there, like the others, and when Van approaches, he recognizes his mother. Still alive, she tries to say something, but the shock completely paralyzes the boy. He refuses to accept reality until he suddenly hears his sister's voice. Even very injured, Rena was alive, but she falls right after calling him. Van immediately supports her, but instead of explanations, she asked him to run away, stating that the one responsible for all this is still looking for him. Van doesn't believe that the second prince has more allies and, at first, tries to help her. The blood on the ground, however, was already forming a puddle too large. In the end, Rena confesses that she also learned to cook, and, crying, reveals that her greatest dream was to see Van eat something made by her. Little by little, the girl's gaze loses its shine, and with her last strength, she asks her brother not to blame himself, for none of this was his fault. In the final moment, Van is literally stabbed in the back by a knight. Along with him, several others celebrate the feat, believing they have just eliminated the leader of the rebel army. Still, one of them notices that the boy remains standing, and his gaze reveals that the will to fight still exists. Before delivering the final blow, the knight asks why Van didn't try to dodge the attack. The boy replies that there was no longer anyone he wanted to protect alive. To the knight, that was a reason worthy of pity. But before accepting his own end, Van asks who ordered that massacre. Without beating around the bush, the man replies that the order came from the Majesty itself, and Van shouts that Heinz would never do something like that. Against all expectations, the blonde appears right there, in flesh and blood. The appearance shocks Van, as, by his words, everything indicated he was just waiting for the right moment to show up. As if that weren't enough, Heinz mocks him, asking if Van was after memories. When explaining the reason for everything, the king states that the fault lay with the boy himself. According to him, assassins capable of ignoring magical detection, hiding anywhere, and eliminating powerful enemies with mere physical strength were a threat, a danger that could shake his reign of peace and, therefore, needed to be eliminated. Van shows disgust at having been deceived, but Heinz declares he will still fulfill his promise. After all, when the Garuda are exterminated, there will be no one left to be discriminated against. The knight then prepares for the killing blow, but this time, Van holds the blade with just one hand. Knowing the truth changes everything, transforming pain into an urgent desire for revenge. Even weak and wounded, Heinz knows better than anyone the monster the boy is. The knights position themselves to protect the majesty. While the king himself prepares to fight, Van crosses the first line of defense in the blink of an eye. Using the secret shadow technique of his lineage, he initiates the attack known as Final Bloom. In response, Heinz concentrates all his magic on the spell called Lucis Sagittarius. Thus, the most powerful blows of the two former friends collide. After long moments of combat, night falls and the bodies of the knights lie scattered on the ground. The most impressive thing is that, even in that state, Van still fought to protect his sister, just as, even in death, he refused to bow to the Alcaire. Heinz considers this the act of a fool, but accepts that he could not change his mind, and admits that he only had to defeat him by force. Later, Van barely remains alive, lost in thought. After fighting so much, he refuses to let his story end there. His revenge was still not complete, so he needed one more chance, a new opportunity to, next time, ensure at least an acceptable fate for his own. Perhaps luck heard his plea, for when his eyes close on the ground, they open in a very familiar room, even more surreal. Rena comes up the stairs asking if her brother has woken up. Van shouts, asking if she is okay, but she doesn't understand anything. Convinced he is dreaming, he hears the girl insist that he get ready. After all, it was his birthday. Their mother appears shortly after, encouraging him to get out of bed. Van looks at himself in the mirror and realizes, incredulously, that he has gone back 10 years in time. To celebrate his 15th birthday, the family was preparing a picnic. His mother and sister said it would be a waste to stay home on such a beautiful day. Van begins to wonder if all of that had really just been a dream. Suddenly, a gust of wind sweeps through the place, scattering flower petals in the air. Among them, one touches the protagonist, and he feels the contact that is enough to understand that everything was real, as he still feels the weight of training in his body. Along with that comes the smell of smoke from the city and Rena's last words. More intense than all of this is the pain of the pierced chest and the screams that still echo in memory. Rena asks what is wrong, but Van changes the subject. Their mother calls him shortly after, informing him that the picnic was almost ready. Van praises the aroma of the food, while Rena wishes her brother a happy birthday. At the same time, a group of knights gallops on a hunt for heretics. There were few strong mages and the number of soldiers was less than ideal, making failure a real risk. Ahead of them was the autonomous district of the Garuda. One of the knights comments that they were not civilians, so it was no problem if some died. Even uncomfortable with that, the Amazon ends up agreeing in silence. Back at the celebration, the protagonist praises the meal, saying the flavor brought a strange nostalgia. This was curious, as his mother had prepared something similar the day before, with Rena's help. Just for that reason, the boy notices small imperfections in the dish. Little by little, he begins to accept the fact that he has gone back 10 years in time. There was a chance to redo everything, although he still didn't know where to start. Once again, his mother asks if he is still worried, and then Van remembers. Among the Garuda at 15, it was common to choose one's own path, and for him, there were 3 options. The first was to work in small jobs in the city, the second to leave in search of dangerous tasks, and the third to follow the life of a mercenary. Even without magic, the Garuda were strong, and because they could not be detected, they did well as escorts. When kingdoms went to war, they were sent to the front lines and almost never survived, but to the few who returned, great riches were promised. The mother comments that the life of a mercenary wasn't all bad, as it was this money that allowed the family to live better. Still, she makes it clear that she did not wish for that future for Van. In the past, he ignored the advice and followed that path, which ultimately led to the encounter with Heinz. Suddenly, all that camaraderie is interrupted by a loud noise. The bell rings, and Van stands up at that very moment, understanding exactly what it meant. For a moment he had forgotten, but soon he runs off and tells his family to leave the city without explaining anything. A little further ahead, a man was giving a speech, saying that the gods had revealed that dirt was sin. According to him, the kingdom still harbored impure and incapable beings known as Garuda. For that group, they were born stained and carried darkness with them. The so-called purifiers were an extremist religious faction within the kingdom of mages. Their radical ideology led them to be treated as heretics by the church, and one of their beliefs stated that the Garuda were agents of evil. On Van's 15th birthday, these fanatics fled the capital and took refuge in the autonomous district. Without any proper security, they began committing atrocities in the name of the so-called purification. That day, Van could only hide in an alley with his family, but now he did not intend to repeat that. Already inside the city, he moves among the people at high speed, climbing walls and going unnoticed. At the end of the speech, one of the purifiers prepares to erase the sins of a Garuda with fire. Van was already upon him, as the most basic rule against mages was to attack them out of perception's reach. The right targets were the brain and the vocal cords, preventing any conjuration. As soon as he takes one down, however, his position is revealed to both allies and enemies. One of the fanatics tries to react in haste, but Van surpasses him and impales him with the enemy's own sword. Only weapons imbued with magic could penetrate mystical barriers, so it was necessary to use the opponent's. Another cultist begins to conjure a long-range electric spell, but Van throws the defeated body against the lightning. Then, he advances from below and delivers a brutal punch, sending the target flying. Van believes there are only 3 opponents left when one of them shouts for him to stop. He was holding a woman hostage, ready to kill her if he was not obeyed. The boy did not expect there to be more enemies, but he also saw no advantage in giving up. The fear etched on the hostage's face is real, and in a desperate impulse, Van kneels, begging the tormentor to stop. The cultist smiles satisfied and shouts that he should have acted like that from the beginning. Soon after, another fanatic kicks Van hard in the stomach, throwing him onto his back on the ground. The remaining purifiers, filled with rage, begin to beat him relentlessly. Although they wanted to make him suffer, the one who seemed to be the leader orders them to finish it quickly. He felt a bad premonition, as if everything could go wrong if they did not eliminate the boy immediately. Noticing that his companions were not obeying, the cultist releases the hostage to act. Without the woman in danger, another person intervenes, casting an ice spell. The spell hits the fanatic from behind, spreading ice all over his body and immobilizing him. The knight then warns him not to move, as he could break. In the name of the kingdom's justice, she decrees the arrest of all the fanatics, leaving the cultist visibly terrified. Van does not quite understand why, in his past life, the reinforcements took so long to arrive. The cultist still tries to order his companions to kill the woman, but they were all as frozen as statues. In light of this, the knights receive the order to disarm each of them, leaving Van alone in front of the one who saved him. She had witnessed everything the boy did, but instead of worrying, she decided to give him all the credit. After all, just the fire mage defeated by Van would have been enough to reduce the entire city to ashes. It wasn't as if she couldn't defeat him, but she was devising a plan to minimize the damage. The fact that Van took him down was, it seems, the trigger for the kingdom to act more quickly. Still, the girl asks what he desires as a reward, but the boy simply thanks her for saving him. Curious, she asks for his name, and upon hearing Van in response, she introduces herself as Helene. Even after he refuses any reward, Helene invites him to visit the Magic Academy, which catches him completely off guard. Upon hearing about the academy, Van asks if it is the kingdom's, and Helene confirms, saying that even common people can enroll if they have talent. He had already heard that name in his past life, as many legendary warriors and wizards had come from there. Still, Van questions why she chose him specifically, then Helene asks to talk somewhere else. She grabs the boy's hand and starts pulling him almost forcefully. As for the destination, she asks him to indicate the way, since he knew the area better than she did. After a few minutes and across the river, the two arrive at a quiet spot where no one could hear them. There, Helene asks if this wouldn't be a perfect place for an assassination. Without warning, she conjures a bow of ice and shoots a freezing arrow in Van's direction. The boy reacts with a speed comparable to a magical step, but without using any magic. Doing something like that with just physical strength startles Helene, as he had already broken her line of sight and reached her blind spot. Even so, Van does not advance, as his instincts indicated that she was just testing him. The girl feels even more apprehensive upon hearing the tone of someone experienced coming from such a young boy. Van then asks if this was a test. Helene replies that it was part of her nature to verify things with her own eyes. He questions what she would do with that information. Directly, she states that Van could have the power to change the fate of the Garuda. However, that would only begin if he enrolled in the Magic Academy. Van asks if she is talking about the Night Conference, and Helene confirms, saying she believes this is possible with his skills. The Night Conference is a system that rewards exceptional students of the Academy. Regardless of class, those approved receive the right to found a noble house in the kingdom. The lands granted usually correspond to the candidate's place of origin. In Van's case, there would be no doubt it would be the autonomous district of the Garuda. This catches him completely off guard, as he had never thought of that possibility. Unlike his past life, he was still below the age limit for the exam. Before accepting, however, Van says he has 3 more questions, and Helene agrees to listen. He remembers that he would need a recommendation from the nobility, but she assures him she will write one. Excited by his interest, Helene asks him to ask the second question. Van finds it absurd to attend a magic academy without having any magic, and Helene agrees. Still, she reminds him that all the winners of the conference had in common the rediscovery of the principle of magic. Studies on potions, magical circles, and other areas showed that magic was much broader than it appeared. Defeating wizards without using magic could also become a field of study if he made the world recognize his strength. In summary, Helene believes that this would not be impossible for Van. In the last question, he asks the true objective behind it all. Van wants to know what she gains by helping him achieve a noble title. Helene asks if he does not trust her. Van replies that he needs to understand what she intends to gain by turning him into the Lord of the Garuda. Even admitting that she would come away with something from this, she refuses to reveal what, keeping him alert regarding the girl. Suddenly, Rena shouts for her brother while running toward him, asking what he was doing there. She had heard that Van had fought with some dangerous guys, and he apologizes for worrying her. This worked, as the girl immediately hugged Van. He always said he would be fine and then did the most dangerous things possible. That's why she wanted to show how much she and their mother worried. Helene observed all that display of affection between the siblings and commented that Van didn't need to trust her. Still, she reminded him that if he sought a title, he would have the right to protect his sister and the whole family. She swore that this was not a trick, using the name and honor of the Steiners family. After Helene left, Van became thoughtful, still holding Rena in his arms. When their mother learned that he had faced the purifiers, she was deeply shaken. However, upon seeing people from all over the town thanking for the help, she recognized her son's heroism, just like her husband's, and smiled. Later, the topic of the academy came up, causing even more surprise. Van explained about the reward, the recommendation, letter, and the decision he had made. Rena tried to argue that that place was exclusive to the Al-Khair, and that's exactly why Van wanted to go, to prove they were not inferior to them. He thought a lot, but couldn't see another way to save everyone. In his past life, he only found meaning by allying with a royal candidate. This time, however, he could not take the kingdom without planning or waste opportunities like the one Helene offered. Van had already died once, so if there was any thread of hope, he would grab it. His desire to end the discrimination against the Garuda remained intact. That shocked both of them, especially the mother, who saw in her son's eyes the same expression as her husband's. Even saying she didn't know if she agreed, she realized she couldn't stop him. Van asked if he would be forgiven, but she was already beginning to accept reality, also accepting that he had inherited his father's stubbornness, which earned a sincere thank you from the boy. Changing the subject, the mother questioned how he would pay the registration fee and the tuition, since the academy was not free. That was perhaps the only point Van had not considered. She didn't expect anyone besides herself to have to fight for that. And Rena also offered to help. But living off the brutal effort of the two seemed worse than death to Van. He fell into despair, trying to imagine how he would earn money until the worry disappeared. Even without asking, Helene sent a reward for the defeated purifiers. That was enough to prepare for the trip with peace of mind. The mother knew Van would face discrimination at the academy, so she asked him not to become bitter. She told him to keep his head held high, for he was her greatest pride, something the boy accepted firmly. Before leaving, Rena promised to make the best mushroom soup when he returned, and Van said he would look forward to it. Thus, he began the journey, saying goodbye from afar, determined to keep the promise this time. After a long walk, he finally arrived at the gates of the place where he would stay for quite some time. It was the time when young people from all over the kingdom gathered at the academy. Alexis von Hohenberg presented himself first, displaying a letter of recommendation from his own father, making the guard bow before the noble. Soon after, Elizabeth Kreutzner showed a letter signed by a duke and received the same respect. Finally, it was the protagonist's turn, but it was obvious he would not go unnoticed. Quickly, the buzz began. Everyone commenting on the Garuda who dared to appear there. Van calmly stated that he was doing nothing wrong, as he was only applying for the exam. This did not ease the guards' irritation. He then reminded them that the academy's motto is to accept everyone, regardless of status. The younger guard became furious, thinking it was a provocation. Van realized the situation was dangerous, as defeating everyone there by force would be easy, but would cause chaos. At that moment, the older guard asked his companion to calm down. Finally, someone with a minimum of common sense had emerged. The veteran commented that every year some deluded Garuda tries to enter. In a somewhat polite tone, he explained that they do not discriminate against anyone, but require a letter of recommendation. What he did not expect was that Van actually had one. With the seal of a noble upon examining it, one of the guards shouted, saying it was impossible and that no noble would do such a thing. He tried to confiscate the seal, believing it to be fake, but Van grabbed the man's arm and threw him to the ground. Everyone there, without exception, was left speechless, while the older guard wondered how his colleague had gone down without even understanding. Soon after, another figure appeared, questioning the reason for all the commotion. At that moment, the two guards knelt before the examining lord. The older one tried to say it was nothing serious, but the Garuda had attracted so much attention that Van had to introduce himself. He calmly explained that he had been recommended by Helene Steinertz. Most did not understand what that meant, but the examiner recognized the authenticity of the letter immediately. In light of this, he swallowed his pride and apologized for the guard's behavior. Even so, the fact that someone like Van had the endorsement of the Steinert's family caused a great stir. The boy quickly realized that Helene was not just any noble. Once inside the academy gates, Van noticed that the environment was dominated solely by the elite. Still, he recognized some familiar faces, like Dietrich, very different from the fearless swordsman he knew. Besides him, the powerful fire mage Shale was also there. Van also identified Lunaris, who would one day become the divine maiden of justice. All those talents gathered in the same place. Unlike him, they would all end up becoming heroes of the kingdom, famous for fighting on the front lines. However, when the succession disputes began, they became pawns of corrupt princes. And one way or another, Van was forced to eliminate them with his own hands. In this life, far from the shadows, he would have to compete with all of them. It wouldn't be easy, but that was the first step to change the kingdom. Suddenly, the first bully appeared, determined to provoke him. Van asked if the comment was directed at him, and the answer was obvious. The boy tried to say he could walk freely through the academy, but the noble felt offended. Just like in the past, he tried to assert himself and belittle him by reflex. The assassin in Van thought about lowering his head. Right after, he remembers his mother's request to maintain his posture. In the past, Heinz also said that self-respect shaped how others reacted. As Van does not respond, the noble loses control and grabs him by the collar. Van only returns a cold stare, making it clear who started this. The provocateur had no idea what he was getting into. Naturally, Van reverses the positions and begins to dominate the situation. Instead of resisting, he harmonizes the forces and manipulates the opponent's movements. It was the same method used against the guard earlier. After knocking him down, Van still offers help to get up. The noble's pride, however, does not allow it, and anger pushes him to cross the line by trying to use magic. At the last second, someone shouts to stop. The order came from Prince Heinz himself, who states that the Garuda are allies of the kingdom faced with the hierarchy. The noble apologizes. Heinz makes it clear that he would not use his royal blood to create distinctions. As students, everyone should be treated the same. This also included Van. At that moment, the boy could hardly believe that Heinz was also there. With the 9th prince willing to take the exam like anyone else, his image of humility grew even more. The fact that he defended a Garuda made many see him as almost a saint. Van then remembers Heinz mentioning the academy in past conversations. In the present, the prince brings up the topic, commenting that the boy seemed nervous. To create empathy, he says he feels the same way due to the difficulty of the exam. Heinz states that there is no reason to be afraid and extends his hand with his charismatic smile. Anyone would feel at ease in front of someone so kind. But now Van knew the true face behind that mask. He was aware of the hidden dirt. This would be the perfect opportunity to kill him. Doing so, however, would be impulsive and throw away everything that brought him here. Heinz continues waiting for the handshake. Van, however, does not reciprocate, inventing some excuse. The prince is left hanging and lowers his hand. Such behavior towards someone who could become king generated immediate murmurs, even more so for the noble who had been humiliated before. At that moment, the examiner appears, announcing that the registrations for this year's exam were closed. Soon after, he informs that he would lead the candidates to the entrance of the so-called shaded forest. The news leaves many anxious. Already at the exam site, with everyone gathered, a coordinator welcomes the participants. He explains that this forest would be the stage for this year's entrance exam. As everyone already knows, the academy is an institution made to refine the elite and govern the kingdom, never bothering to educate the rabble. Therefore, anyone who wanted to stay there needed to prove they had at least a minimum level of power. The shaded forest was known for concentrating a huge amount of magic, and the students' mission was to bring back a flower charged with that energy. It was called the Tear of Heaven, and only bloomed in that specific place. The problem was that the creatures inhabiting the region also possessed magical power. Van knew there would be a practical exam, but had no idea he would have to face magical beasts. Direct interference between candidates was prohibited, but working together was allowed. Still, it would be necessary to collect enough flowers to ensure the approval of the entire group. 2 large teams would face difficulties, and the maximum deadline was only until sunset. Additionally, each participant would receive a badge from the Guardian, used to request rescue in case of danger. However, asking for help meant immediate disqualification. With that, the start of the exam was officially declared, and several students quickly began to group up, choosing allies with compatible skills. Van, on the other hand, ended up alone, believing that this way he would have more freedom to move. When it was finally his turn to receive the badge, the examiner seemed reluctant to hand it over. Still, the object was placed in his hands, and Van left under the watchful eye of that noble. Already, inside the forest, a magical beast appeared without giving time to react. Van quickly identified it as a medium-sized demonic creature. Animals imbued with magic were generally called demonic beasts. They possessed physical strength superior to humans and were also capable of using magic. making them more dangerous than many conjurers. Come to think of it, since becoming an assassin, Van had only fought against people. Still, that did not stop him from advancing and hitting the creature with a direct punch to the abdomen. After all, he also mastered specific techniques to face this type of monster. The impact, besides being brutal, was amplified by the momentum, generating shockwaves that traveled from the surface to the interior of the body. This technique was difficult to use against rational enemies, but perfect for monsters that attacked without thinking. During his time as a mercenary, Van had encountered magical beasts a few times and taken precautions to defeat them. For this reason, he remarked to himself that it was quite unfortunate for the two boys he noticed hiding in the distance. Still, Van didn't worry much, as the noble and his companion apparently hadn't even noticed the confrontation. The aristocrat believed that Van had only won by using poison, while his colleague remembered that interfering in the exam was prohibited. In any case, the examiners had no intention of letting a Garuda advance, especially someone who had been rude to one of the princes, so even if he died, no one should be held responsible. Meanwhile, one of the examiners followed the older guard to an isolated gate. He ordered them to bring the key, and despite the knight trying to change his mind, no argument was sufficient. The evaluator intended to use the trump card sealed behind that gate to pursue the boy who dared to participate in the exam. According to the Academy's rules, it was not possible to eliminate someone who had a recommendation, but if he were approved, the school's image would be tarnished unless an accident occurred. The gentleman tried to warn him about everything that could go wrong, but Van acted alone. No one considered important had been willing to approach him. Thus, with the key in hand, the seal was broken, and the examiner ordered the cursed beast to be unleashed to eliminate the Garuda in the name of the pride of the Royal Academy. For some reason, the second examiner felt that this year's exam would bring serious problems. Noticing this, he saw the colleague who had freed the creature return, which led him to ask where he had been. The other simply replied that he had made some preparations for what was to come, leaving him on high alert. Returning to the protagonist's perspective during his walk, Van found a set of flowers exactly as described. It was the first time he had seen the tears of heaven, and if he picked them and returned, he would be approved, but his pursuers finally decided to show up. The noble commented that Garuda really had a keen sense of smell, similar to that of a dog, while Van replied that, from his own experience, he knew that cowards always attack from behind. The aristocrats, in turn, were determined to break that confident stance of the boy. Deep down, however, he knew they were only there because they had been humiliated in front of the other students. Van said that this was to be expected from proud children and took his stance, which left the noble furious. Without further ado, the two began to prepare their magic to attack. They formed a group consisting of a magical swordsman and a conjuring mage. The styles of magical combat were mostly divided between those who cast spells, simply known as mages. Those who channeled magic into weapons were known as magical swordsmen. Meanwhile, those who reinforced their own bodies with mana, enhancing strength and speed, received the title of magical martial artists. Forming teams with varied styles had always been seen as a smart strategy to exploit the opponent's weaknesses. Even so, Van quickly realized that his enemies had no real experience in killing, although they were bold enough to try. Still, he could not eliminate them in self-defense, as the death of a noble always resulted in revenge from their house. The aristocracy of that time maintained the violent temperament inherited from wartime, and this time the boy wanted to follow a different path. Thus, he decided to avoid assassination techniques and simply defeat them. The noble began to hate Van's confident gaze and charged in with his windblade dance. Van managed to dodge but ended up getting lightly cut on the forearm. Even so, the attacker was annoyed that he hadn't taken him down with that blow. He began to boast, claiming that the Valtrake family was famous for mastering wind spells. In an arrogant tone, he said he would spare Van if he begged for mercy, but received only a mocking response. Van ironically asked if the Valtrake house's specialty was refreshing people in the summer, which made the boy's fury explode again. Without joking, he summoned a storm that seemed to tear the sky, forcing the protagonist to retreat and focus solely on dodging. This caught the noble by surprise, as Van could see the magic whenever the enemy's bloodlust increased too much. The moment the attacks ceased, Van advanced with a devastating counterattack. After seeing his companion fall, the magical swordsman panicked, readied his weapon, and leaped toward the boy. Van quickly realized that the enchantment was simple, as the sword posed no danger without a direct strike. Normally, a blade reaches a speed 2 or 3 times greater than that of a punch. Even so, thanks to his footwork, he ignored the weapon and struck directly at the wrist, deflecting the attack. Seizing the opening, he delivered a short blow to the opponent's arm, knocking him to the ground. Despite the evident frustration of the two, Van asks if they want to continue, making it clear that from then on he wouldn't guarantee their safety. Startled, the noble steps back, swallows his pride, and apologizes, but something catches Van's attention. He feels a strange presence, momentarily ignoring the aristocrats, and upon understanding the danger, shouts for them to flee immediately. Before any of the three can react, the unleashed beast appears and attacks with its horns, throwing them far away. Pain engulfs the boys, while the protagonist reacts with concern upon recognizing the creature. Before them stood a hellbear, a demonic beast of the fang type. The nobles cannot comprehend how a high-level monster could be there. Even so, there was no time for questions, as a new charge was already on its way. These creatures were also known as cursed fangs, enveloped by a magical power comparable to that of a sage. Van warns that if they can still move, now is the right moment to flee. One of them responds that unfortunately that wouldn't be possible. He shows his leg injured from the previous impact and comments that it was probably fractured. At most, he could remain standing, which leaves Van with few alternatives. Carrying them would mean slowing down and ending up dead. Breaking the badge also didn't seem fast enough. Then the noble suggests that his friend flee alone. After all, he was still a powerful mage and could survive. The companion refuses, saying that abandoning him would tarnish the Eisenbach name. Van proposes that one of them activate the badge while the other buys time. The Eisenbach rejects the idea, stating that dying would be less dishonorable. Thus, to avoid tarnishing the family's reputation, the two decide to fight until the end, heads held high. For Van, that was the worst possible scenario, as he would have to deal with the pride of the two. Irritated, he shouts that if they are going to fight, then they should win, instead of dying trying. The noble considers that arrogance, but with the three in the same situation, the only option was to cooperate. Back at the forest entrance, the second examiner comments that it was already time. The first asks what he was talking about, but the colleague avoids answering and questions if any badge had been broken. The negative response sounds strange to the first examiner and curiously pleasant to the second. This meant that Van hadn't even had time to ask for help. Before the exam, the candidate's belongings had been confiscated, and the examiner used one of them to make the beast memorize Van's scent. Now he believed that the boy had already turned to dust and that all that was left was to wait, which is why he couldn't contain his laughter. Returning to the protagonist's perspective, as the monster advanced, the three boys prepared for defense. Van shouts that he will hold it while the nobles attack with everything they have. Waltraich refuses to take orders, but the creature approaches too quickly, and sensing the danger, Van throws himself to the front line at the last moment. This time, he uses assassination techniques, repeating the crushing blow from before, using the beast's own speed against it. Unlike the medium-sized creature, the effect wasn't as devastating, but it still caused an impact. This strike worked by anticipating the enemy's movement, hitting exactly where the attack originated. When a quadruped moves, the first part to advance is always the head. Van distributed the impact across several layers of penetration, but grew anxious as he realized he wasn't reaching the inner regions. The loss of muscle mass and height after returning so many years into the past had left the boy visibly weaker. Having done all he could at that moment, he shouts, and Waltraich conjures the Sky Ripper spell. The blades of wind crash down on the beast, and soon after, Eisenbach tries to attack with his magical sword, but the monster's skin was too resistant. To make matters worse, the creature goes into a rage, and Van shouts at the last second for everyone to get away. Even so, the beast charges again, running at full speed and creating an absurd wind around it. When the protagonist looks back, he sees his two allies fallen and immobilized, though still breathing. Waltraich managed to deflect part of the impact with magic, but he knew he wouldn't withstand another charge. Eisenbach was already accepting that this would be the end, as his sword wasn't even having an effect. Still standing, Van asserts that he would try one more time. To the noble's surprise, he says that on the next attempt, the three would finish off the monster together. Waltraich questions if the boy hadn't just realized that his magic wasn't working. Then Van suggests that he mix stones into the spell to increase its destructive power. For Eisenbach, he advises focusing on pushing the blade into the creature's weakest points. Waltraich asks seriously what the boy was thinking. To him, it was obvious that they had no chance of winning, while Van, in that state, could still flee. Sincerely, Waltraich wouldn't blame him for escaping after everything they tried to do. Even so, Van responds that he wasn't there for revenge, as his only desire was for his race to be recognized as part of the kingdom. For that reason, he states that he couldn't abandon companions from the same nation he wanted to belong to. Waltraich feels a shock of reality, reviewing everything he had done, along with a huge weight of guilt. At that moment, the monster prepares for the final charge, and noticing this, Van shouts to put the plan into action. At Van's signal, Waltraich activates his Windblade dance. Following the protagonist's suggestion, he incorporates stones into the spell, renaming it Black Dust Sky Cutter. A dark blade, laden with sand and gravel, descends violently upon the beast with fangs. Fortunately, the attack blocks its vision, and Van announces that now it was his turn, advancing over the monster. The shoulders of quadrupeds function differently from humans. They do not connect directly to the spine, creating a flexible area for the movement of the front legs, but compromising stability. With this in mind, the protagonist activates his harmony technique called rotation, knocking the creature to the ground. As it falls, Van shouts that the heart is located at the front base between the front legs. Eisenbach doesn't waste time and leaps to attack, but his lack of experience makes him hesitate in front of the monster's fierce gaze. Even terrified, the boy acts as agreed and plunges the sword in. Waltraich shouts in celebration of victory, but the protagonist does not feel the same relief. Somehow, he realizes that the strike did not hit the heart. Perhaps the hesitation was the reason, and now the creature was starting to recover. As a defense, the monster activates the destructive roar, a rare ability of predatory beasts that channels magic through its voice. A shockwave spreads, knocking everything around down. Eisenbach falls to the ground bleeding and, at that moment, feels that his internal organs have been damaged. To make matters worse, the beast was close enough to devour him alive. At that pace, nothing but death seemed possible. But before the noble could be finished off, Van steps in front of him. Among the harmony techniques, this one was known as spiral, not focusing on competing strength, but on redirecting the impact in a spin to the ground. Even so, the beast was out of control, and Van knew he couldn't deflect all that power. Only one last alternative remained, and even if his body suffered from it, it would still be better than dying there. Van screams in desperation for his companions to run as fast as possible. Eisenbach gathers the little energy he has left to manage to get up. Meanwhile, Van continues holding the creature's horns, preventing its advance, although exhaustion was already etched on his face. Unlike the boy, the monster only increased its strength until Van is thrown far away, crashing violently against a tree. Waltraich tries to react, but the protagonist shouts for him not to approach. Inevitably, the beast charges in his direction, and Waltraich also rushes forward to try to save him. Even injured, Van was already prepared not to die there. He recites softly, "Sink my heart and free these chains that bind me." Something terrible was about to happen, but before that, an ice spell hits the front paw of the predatory beast. The impact makes the monster roar in pain and fall to the ground, preventing it from reaching Van. The most concerning thing was the origin of that spell, coming from Prince Heinz himself, something none of the three expected. The nobles try to warn that it was too dangerous for the Majesty to remain there. Heinz responds that protecting the citizens of the kingdom is the duty of royalty, which visibly touches both of them. In Van's view, this was exactly how he always gained people's trust before leading them to death. Now, emerging as a false light at the end of the tunnel, Heinz proposes an alliance among the four. Anticipating this, Van shouts that he refuses. The expressions of the nobles vary between irritation and confusion, as does the prince's own. Even so, the protagonist reaffirms that he does not intend to cooperate. He makes it clear that the power of the royal heir is not necessary. Waltraich demands respect, while Eisenbach reminds that Heinz had saved their lives. Van responds that he would have solved everything alone if the prince hadn't interfered. In light of this, Heinz asks if the boy really doesn't need help. Van replies that he does, walking towards the monster, and asks the blonde to just stay quiet and watch, as royalty usually does. Van warns that the beast was moving again, and soon it charges back towards the group. This time Eisenbach wants to at least land a single blow. The protagonist urges calm, stating that running now would be wasting one's own life. Waltraich comments that he only has mana for one more attack, but Van simply asks both to pay attention to his signals, including Heinz. This time, Van shows a different determination, which ends up spreading to the others. He advances to intercept the monster, remembering how scared he was earlier. Therefore, he believes he can win without resorting to that forbidden technique. Until then, 3 of his harmony techniques had failed against the prey beast. The monster begins to see them as worthy adversaries, and starts to act more cautiously. In this way, Van dodges a sweeping strike, jumps, and notices a small opening to advance. The creature roars furiously and tries to chase him, but the boy keeps dodging, using the enemy's own body as support. Waltraich cannot believe such speed was possible without magic, just like the prince. In fact, by shifting his center of gravity without pushing his feet on the ground, Van eliminated preparatory movements. This technique was only known among the highest-level martial artists. Thus, it made no sense to see him kick, jump, and escape from that demonic beast. In a final move, Van steps on the monster's head, leaving the nobles impressed. Heinz, however, knew that attacks without magic were almost caresses for creatures of that level. As the beast continued to fight, the prince believed the situation was about to spiral out of control. Van, however, asserts that this is perfect. After all, his true goal was to irritate the enemy. Soon, the signs of the destructive roar begin to emerge. At that moment, the protagonist shouts for Waltraich to use his wind magic, which he does immediately, mixing stones inside the creature's mouth. This blocks the beast's respiratory system, causing it to fall to the ground. Without wasting time, Van leaps onto the enemy and, face to face, prepares his crushing double blow, known as Twin. The attack strikes directly at the center of the demon beast's head. The shockwaves from the right and left converge at a single point within the skeleton, like circles in water meeting. With this, the demon beast is completely incapacitated. With the first 2 steps completed, Van signals to Eisenbach, who simply spins his sword and cuts the beast into pieces. The nobles are in shock, unable to believe they have defeated a high-level monster. Eisenbach asks what the protagonist is doing, and Van simply stares at Heinz in silence, before turning and extending his hand to help him up. The boy confesses that his internal organs feel sore, as if they were injured. Van explains that this type of sound magic can be partially neutralized by plugging the ears, and the noble states he will never forget this. Having overcome the danger, it was time to think about the next objective. But to the protagonist's surprise, where there had once been several flowers, only 2 remained. That was the consequence of forming large groups, something that had been warned from the beginning. Van tries to think quickly of a solution, knowing that time was running out. Before he can say anything, the nobles take the initiative, picking the flowers and deciding to distribute them. Naturally, the first is given to Heinz, as he is a prince. Van questions why give the flower to someone who only observed, but Waltrake doesn't even pay him any attention. After all, the second flower is handed directly to the protagonist. Van asks if he is sure, and the boy replies that he doesn't want to owe anything to anyone, also revealing his name, Falk. Eisenbach takes the moment to introduce himself as Ralph. Surprised by the attitude of the two, the protagonist says his name is Van, and they exchange a quick greeting, even knowing they might never meet again. At that moment, Heinz intervenes, picking up some wilted flowers from the ground and revitalizing them with light magic, to everyone's astonishment. He asks everyone to accept the gesture, assuring that no one would be harmed. Van notices that the sunset was approaching and warns that they needed to leave the forest as soon as possible. The tone sounded like an order, which made Falk slightly irritated. Before they leave, however, the prince catches the protagonist's attention. Heinz comments that Van had covered his feet with dirt earlier. Then, he mentions having heard of a movement technique used to conceal tracks, very common among assassins. Adding this to the martial arts demonstrated in the fight, he directly asks if Van is, or has ever been, an assassin. Heinz had many enemies. After conquering several territories, the king hardened the kingdom's laws by taking foreign princesses as wives. Heinz's mother, however, was already noble before this, becoming the 5th queen and the first of the kingdom of Ferranes. Because of this, his brothers and their respective mothers feared he might ascend to the throne. Assassination attempts could come from anywhere, and Heinz always prepared for that. If Van were an infiltrated agent, the prince was determined to eliminate him right there. Van did not expect that old habits would betray him in a moment like that. Technically, he was a trained assassin, but admitting that would be suicide, so he decided to play dumb. The prince immediately notices the maneuver, and the protagonist makes it clear that he would not back down if Heinz wanted to settle things that way. The atmosphere between the two becomes heavy, and a confrontation seems inevitable. When Van steps forward, Falk instinctively jumps in front of him. Heinz maintains a serious look, but in the next instant Van appears at his side, saying he was just joking. Falk cannot understand how he moved so quickly. Van seizes the moment to try to ease the tension with good manners. Heinz, however, ignores the small talk attempt and notices something more important. Van did not take advantage of the opening he deliberately left. It became clear that this was a test, so the prince demands a direct answer. He repeats the question, citing the previous habit, wanting to know if the boy was an assassin. Van replies that it was Helene who taught him those techniques and all the other forms of hand-to-hand combat. Inside, he apologizes for using her name. Heinz's expression changes instantly upon hearing that the Garuda's recommendation came from the Steinart's house. Ralph begins to explain that this duchy was not just any noble family. Van already suspected that Helene was someone special. Without knowing the details, the prince clarifies that she was known as the Lady of the Ice Flower. Ranked above the best students at the academy, it made sense that one of her disciples would be exceptional. Moreover, the Steinart's house was the oldest serving the kingdom, which ruled out any sending of assassins. Heinz still asks how Van got the recommendation, but the boy had little to add. In the prince's view, that letter had been delivered to cultivate a future servant of the house. After seeing Van's skills, Heinz commented that he would have recruited him too if he had arrived earlier. Additionally, if something was truly pursuing him, he bet it was the beast itself. The prince admits he had no idea how that creature appeared there. Still, since everyone had helped to get out alive, Heinz thanked them. For the nobles, that was the highest honor possible. But for Van, it didn't mean much. Once again, Falk asks for patience and tells the boy to stop being disrespectful. Instead of seeking recognition, the protagonist reacts with total indifference. All of this only made Heinz even more intrigued by that strange boy. Back at the entrance of the forest, the approved candidates begin to gather. Meanwhile, those who failed lament in silence. The second examiner counts, and the first informs that, including the prince, 4 were still missing. The information leaves the second uneasy, fearing that something had gone wrong. Originally, the forest only housed monsters that Heinz could defeat. He never wanted the prince to be harmed by something he caused himself. At that moment, someone emerges from the trees, to the examiner's relief, who believed it was Heinz. However, the first to appear is Van, mocking, asking if everyone was gathered to welcome him. Unlike his colleague, the second examiner's first reaction is to ask how the boy was still alive. The first does not understand the remark, and Van questions if he shouldn't be. Quickly, the examiner dodges, saying he was just impressed. The protagonist retorts, stating that he was not the only one surprised. Right behind him, his noble companions appear carrying the beast's body, shocking everyone around. It was the head of the beast with fangs that attacked them inside the forest, brought as proof. Even knowing exactly why, both examiners pretend to be surprised upon seeing that monster. Still, the second's tone sounds almost like an accusation. The first asks him to repeat, and again the other hides behind the word impressive. Heinz then speaks up, describing the confrontation as a magnificent battle. Seeing the prince there, the second examiner nearly panics. When questioned, Heinz explains that, by coincidence, he was close to the fight. This was a disaster for the second, who had sent the beast and would be executed if this came to light. The prince notices the nervousness, and for the third time, the examiner uses the excuse of surprise. Even wishing for a long life for the kingdom, his attitude already seemed too suspicious. Honestly, Heinz states that he participated little in the combat. He makes it clear that the victory was the work of the 3 candidates, mainly Van. The examiners cannot believe it, just like the other students around. Ralph makes a point of praising the protagonist. Falk openly admits that he followed his orders during the fight. The second examiner murmurs that this would be impossible for a Garuda. However, with the recommendation from the Steinart's house, even the prince did not find it strange. Van knew that Helene had never taught him any of that, but he couldn't say so. The public approval of Heinz combined with the letter begins to change the general opinion. The first examiner then bows in gratitude to the protagonist. As a servant of the kingdom, he expresses gratitude for protecting the prince. Van tries to explain that he defended no one, he merely survived. Even so, he shows his flower, immediately imitated by the other 2. The examiners exchange glances, and it becomes clear that the second must act. He calls the name of the prince, followed by the 2 approved nobles. Finally, with visible discomfort, he also summons the last candidate. With a trembling voice, he announces Van as approved in the entrance exam. Thus, in a chaotic manner, the boy secures his spot at the academy. As for the appearance of the beast, the first examiner takes on all the bureaucracy. Days later, before the new generation of talents, the director declares that the academy seeks more than just skill. According to him, the most important thing was true nobility, to become the sword and shield of the kingdom. Van never imagined being among nobles in his past life. That was just a small step. Still, it represented the beginning of his goal to end discrimination against his people. From the height of the ceremony location, Hélène watched everything with pride on her face. After confirming that everything had gone well, Hélène proceeded to the place that summoned her. She entered a luxurious room where, among 5 chairs, one was reserved for her. By all indications, all the important members of that group were already present. Among them was the sword princess, Karina Luthier. Also present was the silver strategist, Amelia Rodenwald. The elegant silence came from Arnulf Clauvius, who explained that they were gathered to discuss the only common issue. The 8th prince, Onus Farania, completed the group, being responsible for dealing with foreign forces. Deep down, Helene already knew exactly what it was about. Amelia and Arnulf agreed that something unusual had happened. For the first time since its founding, the academy had accepted a student descended from the Garuda. Karina complained that the school had become too tolerant, an opinion shared by the 8th prince. More than that, Onus wanted to know why the recommendation had come from one of the 5 brilliant crowns. It was evident that he demanded an explanation, and Helene's decision now put her in a delicate position. The academy gathered sons and daughters of nobles, all with great magical power and inflated pride. When that pride clashed, conflicts were inevitable. To contain this chaos, a group of idealistic students took on the role of the 5 brilliant crowns. Once again, the 8th prince questions what Helene was thinking by recommending a Garuda. She replies that she merely recognized his strength, something Karina considered absurd. In her view, the Garuda were cursed by the gods for lacking true power. Amelia agrees, stating that there is no sword or shield for the kingdom without magic. Onus supports this idea, as it was the common thought within the country. Helene, however, calls it a view too convenient, used by those who did not want to think beyond. The comment strikes the prince, who feels offended. Arnulf then suggests something simple. Test the boy and draw their own conclusions. Onus likes the proposal and asks Helene's opinion. If Van proved weak, her recommendation would be called into question, but the girl does not oppose. Still, she warns that whoever is sent should not underestimate him, or they would end up humiliated. Surprisingly, Karina offers to personally test the boy's abilities. The prince did not expect someone from the 5 chairs to want to deal with this. Helene asks if something about Van had caught her attention. Karina coldly replies that she just wanted to destroy him to shake Helene's confident demeanor. Back to the protagonist's school routine, the surrounding environment was filled with conversations about classes and unresolved tasks. It had been a week since his enrollment at the academy. Since then, unexpectedly, Van had been living in relative peace, despite some occasional provocations. One day, in class, the most arrogant teacher asked if Van could explain the theory of the 4 elements in magic. Silence fell immediately. That question was far above the class level. The teacher himself was already thinking of backing down. After all, Garuda couldn't even read, according to him. Van, however, responds that it was a method to stabilize 4 basic factors: flow, density, resonance, and fixation. He adds that the theory prevented magical stagnation, restored energy, and served as the basis for modern formulas, all while smiling. After this demonstration, the constant harassment simply ceased. Moreover, Van now had friends, like Ralph, who appeared patting him on the back and inviting him to lunch. Van comments that he was a bit worried about him and Falk. When Ralph asks why, the protagonist just calls him to the cafeteria. The response leaves the friend confused, to say the least. This brief season of peace ends when a girl appears behind the two. Van directly asks what she wanted, but the situation seemed trivial, as they had merely bumped into each other. To avoid problems, both apologize politely. Suddenly, the girl points a sword at the protagonist's throat, leaving Ralph in panic. She claims that common people kneel before nobles. According to her, in the case of a Garuda, the least one could do is kiss the ground. Van calmly responds that there was no reason for that, since everyone there was a student. The girl insists on reminding him of his position in that hierarchy. Even as a veteran, Ralph asserts that this intimidation had gone too far. She states that she did not intend to spill blood, as long as Van demonstrated an obedience befitting his status, something that clearly was not going to happen. Basic respect between veterans and newcomers made sense, but when someone tried to impose that hierarchy by force, Van felt like doing the exact opposite. When he leans against the girl's sword, she pulls the blade back to prevent him from holding it. Even so, Van manages to twist the weapon and push it back. Her stance breaks, and reflexively the girl tightens her fist. With that, the weight of her body falls on the thin blade, making it as easy to break as vegetables under a sharp knife. The metal snaps as it combines bending and twisting, reaching the material's tension limit. Van asks if she mixed zinc into the sword and comments, with some disdain, that it is unfortunate to be threatened by a common weapon. Zinc swords are cheap and withstand impacts, being good for training but terrible in real fights. The girl replies that real blades are not allowed on campus, and reminds him that she is not part of the 5 crowns. In any case, for her, her part there was already done. At that moment, after Van proves he has strength, Karina appears demanding punishment for disrespecting a veteran and for damaging someone else's property. Ralph can hardly believe that the Sword Princess was there in person. Van, on the other hand, recognizes that figure from the bloody history on the battlefield, where thousands had fallen by her hand. This makes him wonder what someone like her was doing inside the academy. In his first life as an assassin, several rebellions had shaken the kingdom. Behind the scenes, there was a militant faction remaining from the Purification sect, known as the Circle of White Annihilation. Among its members, the most feared was Karina, a demonic swordswoman responsible for the deaths of countless heroes. Although the kingdom destroyed the circle at a high cost, the chaos left behind sparked the war for the throne's succession. Van had seen her only once on the battlefield. To this day, he did not understand why an old enemy of the kingdom was now in the academy. Breaking the silence, Karina announces that she would have to impose an additional punishment. According to her, facing a veteran in silence was also a sign of disrespect. Van promptly apologizes, claiming he did not recognize her as superior. The response only makes her even more irritated. Ralph tries to explain, anxiously, that she is part of the 5 brilliant crowns. Van admits that he did not even know what that meant. Briefly, they explain that the 5 crowns are a disciplinary council made up of the best students. Karina had been part of the group since she enrolled in the academy at 13. Van shows genuine surprise, and the girl thanks him for the reaction. It is clear that she belongs to the high nobility, with her status kept secret after becoming a rebel. The protagonist thinks for a moment that this could be his chance to eliminate her and prevent a future rebellion. If that happened, the succession war would never even begin, and Heinz would never ascend to the throne. Still, Karina resumes her speech about punishment, stating that rambling before her was another affront. Van assumes a defensive posture. At that moment, she warns him that she will make him remember why she is allowed to wield a real sword. That position was typical of her before a swift execution strike, too fast to be seen. Ralph shouts for Van to just apologize. The protagonist pushes his friend away and says he also needed to confirm something. Karina considers that a foolish move. The two stare at each other from opposite sides of the hall, while the other students watch in total tension. In an instant, Karina appears on the other side, already with her sword sheathed, while Van falls injured. Ralph rushes to help his friend, but the girl says not a word. Instead of continuing, she decides to postpone the punishment. In her view, Van was not someone who deserved to be exterminated immediately. The two leave the hall, leaving the boy hurt and restless. A few minutes later, Karina's subordinate questions why she spared the novice. Already far away, Karina finally reveals her condition and falls to her knees on the ground. She did not spare him out of mercy, but because she had also been injured, to her colleague's surprise. Karina had read about something similar in martial arts books, called pressure points. The pain she felt made any proper movement difficult. A subordinate asks if both had exchanged direct blows. Karina knows with absolute certainty that it was nothing of the sort. The moment she approached, she intended to strike the boy's neck. However, Van ducked at the last moment and countered, aiming directly at a vital point without hesitation. Her reflex was to instinctively retreat to dodge, which ended up diverting the sword's path. Meanwhile, the protagonist's hands moved with absolute precision towards the pressure point. That was the beginning of a combined attack, a technique taught only in certain sword schools, something Van should never have known. To the subordinate, Karina had won by still being on her feet. She declares the victory as evident, and Karina agrees aloud. Deep down, however, she knew very well that this was not true. After all, strikes to pressure points are not lethal, which meant Van tried to defeat her without causing serious harm. In a real confrontation, the outcome would have been different. Moreover, she had underestimated him. Irritated, Karina asserts that next time, she would be much more prepared. Back to the protagonist's perspective, as Ralph carried him, he asks about the detail Van wanted to confirm. He says he was worried and, naturally, curious. The boy, however, does not give much importance to the matter. Despite her harsh words, Karina was not using a real sword, and her magic was different from the time of terror. That made clear a certain degree of mercy. Van even comments, almost distracted, that she was surprisingly kind. That fight served to confirm that the current Karina was not the same as in the past. As they headed to the infirmary, Van thinks that perhaps it was possible to change her instead of killing her. The next day, the protagonist enters the classroom and walks to his desk as always. Still, he notices too many eyes on him. He sits in his usual spot, away, but begins to hear murmurs about having challenged one of the 5 crowns. This makes him slightly uneasy. Shortly after, Ralph and Falk appear, telling him to ignore those idiots. The two seem determined to help him apologize. Van makes it clear that this is not his intention. He comments that when they met, they didn't seem so intrusive. Even so, he thanks them for their concern and says he will handle it alone. If he wanted to avoid a tragedy in the future, he needed to confront Karina now. In any case, he did not believe he had anything to fear from disciplinary students. It is at this moment that the Lady of the Ice Flower appears, asking to speak with Van. Naturally, the protagonist asks why, since class would start soon. Helene simply insists, saying that the conversation wouldn't take long. Driven by curiosity, Van agrees, and the two leave the room together. This causes general surprise, as not only did he know the Lady of the Ice Flower, but he spoke to her casually. Later, in a quiet place, Helene explains that she is tasked with testing his skills. Van comments that this should have been said right at the start. She apologizes, stating that she didn't expect things to escalate so quickly, especially regarding Karina's advance. Helene describes her as the pinnacle among the nobles and future leader of House Luthier, despite her age. Even so, Van says he does not see her merely as a genius. He explains that he feels Karina has thrown everything away except for the sword. Helene is surprised to hear this, but admits it is true. Originally, Karina was just an illegitimate daughter of House Luthier. She couldn't even learn basic noble etiquette. At 10 years old, however, she defeated her older brother, who was 17, in a casual duel. He was the legitimate heir. Because of her talent with the sword, Karina began to be treated as an official daughter. Still, she grew up surrounded by envy and without affection. Regarding how she knew all this, Helene comments that nobles love to gossip. Even so, before Karina entered the academy, Helene saw her alone at an event. She was distanced from everyone, staring at her father from behind, with an empty gaze for someone so young. Van suggests that she should have spoken to Karina at that time. Helene replies that she couldn't. As both came from great houses, any forced approach would be seen as a political affront. Van considers that an extremely problematic situation. Helene admits that she was previously bound by those ties. Karina, on the other hand, seemed not to care. She always had the feeling that the girl could follow a dangerous path someday. Van then asks what Helene would do if that happened. She replies that she would stop her, as she had fled from that responsibility for too long. At that moment, the protagonist finally begins to understand everything. Helene's skills as a mage were on par with those of the other heroes, but her name had never been revealed. She probably tried to stop Karina when the girl became a rebel and ended up dying in that confrontation, without even having had the chance to build her own reputation. Even while saying things capable of touching anyone, Helene asks Van not to treat her like someone deserving of pity. He replies that he understands, but admits that hearing that story only made him more motivated. Now, he was determined to crush any regret that Karina might carry. Before, no one had been able to stop her, but now Van had a real chance to cut the evil at its root. Deep down, Helene confesses that she might have been hoping to hear exactly that. She asks if the boy already had a plan. Van responds that he would never act without one. When questioned about what it would be, he asks Helene to follow him after class. After the activities ended, the protagonist's classmates also sought him out. Falk comments that they were getting too involved in his life. Ralph, on the other hand, admits curiosity about Van's disappearance after meeting Helene, and Falk agrees. Shortly after, the two spot the protagonist further ahead. However, he wasn't standing still. He was in the midst of a fight against the Ice Flower Lady herself. Both are thrown back by the force of the impact. Helene sarcastically asks where Van was looking and activates her ice magic, the Garden of 1,000 Thorns. Ralph and Falk are left speechless. Van positions himself in front of them at the last moment. With a martial arts strike, he completely shatters the magic. Then, he looks at the two and comments that they arrived just in time. Soon after, he asks them to join him. Our video ends here. If you liked it, leave your like. See you next time. Bye-bye.